Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace be upon you all, and welcome to the second in a series of 4 talks held by Leeds University Union Islamic Society as part of Discover Islam Week. We have a marquee outside the Edward Boyle Library and a display in Parkinson Court, which we have organized as part of this week to provide information about Islam to the wider community. These will be up all week, inshallah, and include a special collection from Leeds City Museum. So please take this opportunity to have a look, take part in our activities, and to speak to our many student volunteers. Tonight, we are honored to have Mustapha Sheikh delivering our second talk entitled Shari'ah, Mercy in Diversity. Mustapha Sheikh completed his undergraduate studies in project management from the University College London in 2000. He changed direction, however, after traveling in the summer of 2000 to Damascus, Syria, where he studied a course in Arabic that led to a degree in Islamic Law, which he completed in 2006. Back in the UK, he completed a master's in the study of religion at the Faculty of Theology, University of Oxford, and presently, as well as teaching modules in Islamic Studies at the University of Leeds, he continues at Oxford as a doctoral candidate. Mustapha Sheikh's thesis is primarily a study of the reformist thought of Ahmad al-Rûmî al-Aqhisarî, an Ottoman-Hanafi scholar of the 17th century. His language interests include classical Arab, Ottoman, and modern Turkish. Just a few housekeeping notes before we inshallah start our talk. The 5 exits are over at the front, 1 on the left and the right, and 2 at the back. We are not expecting a fire drill today, but if the alarm does go out, please make your way slowly and calmly to the exits and out of the front doors. Can I remind all members in the audience to please switch off your mobile phones and to refrain from talking until the end. If you need to leave the lecture early, please do so from the back entrance without disturbing the talk, so that the other members of the audience are not disturbed. There will be a Q&A session after the talk, so please hold your questions. There will be some recitation of the Holy Quran now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وقفينا على آثارهم بعيسى ابن مريم مصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة وآتيناه الإنجيل فيه هدى ونور ومصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة وهدى وموعظة للمتقين. وليحكم أهل الإنجيل بما أنزل الله فيه ومن لم يحكم بما أنزل الله فأولئك هم الفاسقون. وأنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب ومهيمنا عليه فاحكم بينهم بما أنزل الله ولا تتبع أهواءهم عما جاءك من الحق لكل جعلنا منكم شرعة ومنهاجا ولو شاء الله لجعلكم أمة واحدة ولكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون. صدق الله العظيم.
Can I ask Mr. Mustapha Sheikh to come now to talk?
Assalamu alaikum. Let me welcome you all first of all. Thank you all for being here this evening. My talk this evening is entitled Shari'ah, Mercy in Diversity. The inspiration for this title is derived from a statement attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Ikhtilafu ummati rahmah. Difference of opinion in my community is a mercy. I think it's an appropriate time to be speaking about the subject of the Shari'ah, given that since the very recent success of the popular revolution in Egypt, analysts have been nervously cogitating over what a reintroduction of Islamic law may mean for the Middle East. Of course, it's not the Shari'ah specifically that is the focus of analysts, but rather the Muslim Brotherhood, al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, in the context of Egypt. The Ikhwan al-Muslimun are an Islamist party who firmly believe that Islamic law can bring to the Egyptians the justice, peace and prosperity they've been desperately yearning. It's no secret that Islamic law can conjure in the Western mind a plethora of connotations, not always pleasant. The media has surely some hand in this for its notorious portrayal of Islamic law as barbaric, retrograde and primitive. It follows that Islamic law would only appeal to a society that shares these characteristics. Is it then of any surprise that the possibility of an Islamist party coming to power in a country as large and as significant as Egypt, or even maneuvering itself into a position of influence into regional politics, is a cause for concern and consternation among international onlookers? An error frequently made is to view the Ikhwan al-Muslimun as a monolithic group. In a recent book of his, Tariq Ramadan corrects this mistake, saying that they are not a monolithic reality, and neither is Islamism, or political Islam as a whole. In fact, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood go back many decades, and there are clearly two generations now that it represents. One which is of those who are in their 60s and 70s, and a younger generation with quite differing ideas. Tariq Ramadan says there is an internal struggle between generations and between trends within the Brotherhood. Now, what I wish to focus on today is not Islamism and all of its diversity, but rather on diversity within Islamic law. I hope, however, that my analysis will facilitate an understanding of how diversity obtains among and within Islamist groups, these groups which bind their ideologies and political manifestos intimately with the Sharia. More importantly, though, I hope that my analysis facilitates an understanding of how diversity obtains in the broader Muslim intellectual tradition. Let's return to the prophetic tradition that I quoted at the beginning. اختلاف أمتي رحمة, that difference of opinion in my community is a mercy. In this hadith lies the idea that difference, diversity, even divergence, is not only sanctioned by the divine, but is in fact a divine gift. This prophetic traditional hadith does not stand alone in isolation, but in fact is supported by numerous other prophetic hadith and also verses from the Quran, all supporting the idea that difference is both a positive feature of the human condition and that it should be embraced. The preeminent verse in the Quran in this regard is one which Yahya recited just a short while ago. I'll find it here amongst these slides. It's the verse in front of you here. To each among you, we have prescribed a law, Shari'ah, and an open way or method, minhaj. If God had so willed, He would have made you all a single people, ummatan wahida. But His plan is to test you in what He has given you. So strive, as in a race, in all virtues. The goal of you all is to God. It is He that will show you the truth of the matters in which you dispute. Now this verse is significant in our context for several reasons. Firstly, this is one of the very few occasions in the Quran where you will find the word Shari'ah or Shari'ah, which is of the same root and with the same meaning. Though in the usage of the Quran, the word Shari'ah has the specific meaning of law, interestingly the word prior to the Quran's revelation was used by Arabs to mean a waterhole. Ibn Ashur, one of the great modern exegetes, says in his commentary of the Quran that law is referred to as Shari'ah by way of metaphor, since in observing the law there is an opportunity for self-purification and elevation. It is striking that the verse speaks of a plurality of shari'ahs. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. For each of you we have established a law and a method. So there's a plurality of shari'ahs or systems of law, rather than a single, domineering, and absolute paradigm. Secondly, each of these shari'ahs or systems of law seem to be sanctioned by the Quran itself. Thirdly, each shari'ah is accompanied by a minhaj, a method. In Hebrew, minhag, which is the Hebrew cognate. Methods, again in the plural, so for each of you, we have also established a method or recognized a method of understanding that law. Again, the Quran seems to be advocating the validity of each of these methods. Fourthly, a possible outcome of diversity is intolerance, dispute, disharmony, discord. The verse thus recommends that difference be accepted as God's will. It's pointless to try and prevent it. And rather than be allowed to develop into a cause for dispute, people should get on with the business of trying to live by the law, which they adhere to as best as they can. The verse is clearly a useful point of departure for interreligious dialogue. But my concern here is what sort of bearing this verse has had on intra-Muslim dialogue. Now let me be clear, this evening my focus is on Sunni Islam, often reckoned as the accounting for anywhere between 70 and 85% of the Muslim world. Muslims, from very early on in their history, came to recognize two inerrant sources of authority, one of which would end with the passing away of the Prophet Muhammad, and the other which would continue as long as the believing community survives and is in existence. The first inerrant source of knowledge was the Quran, considered by Muslims as the verbatim word of God, Kalamullah, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Marcel Gauchet, the French historian, philosopher and sociologist, has said in his book, The Disenchantment of the World, the Quran's revelation is itself the literal and indisputable presence of the transcendent in immanence, and this dispensed with interpreters, lest it succumb to the uncertainties of internal judgment or to an outbreak of subjective values. No clergy, no reformation. This, of course, does not mean that there was philosophical unanimity and single-mindedness in Islamic society. Once the Quran's message had been properly received, a variety of schools and interpretations flourished, and we can correctly speak of Islamic pluralism. But put simply, agreement had to be reached on the meaning and object of interpretation. It was not concerned with the substance of revelation itself and the real content of God's will. In Islam, there was no doubting that the Quran is God's eternal word. The disputes were about how we should adapt ourselves to this indivisible block of law and meaning. The Quran then was uniquely vested with the status of infallibility. Though an interpretation of the Quran in the Muslim community may indeed become respected or even revered, it would never be placed on par with the Quran, let alone supplant it. The Prophet himself undertook to prevent this from ever happening. That is, a scripture or a book besides the Quran being placed besides it or put on par with it. And he prohibited his companions from recording from him anything other than the Quran. He says in a tradition narrated in Bukhari, "La taktubu anni," do not record anything from me. وَمَنْ كَتَبَ عَنِّي غَيْرَ الْقُرْآنِ فَلْيَمْحُ, and whoever records anything other than the Quran that comes from my mouth, then let him wipe it out. وَلَكِنْ حَدِّثُوا عَنِّي وَلَا حَرَجْ. However, if you wish to narrate orally from me things that I have said, or things that you've seen me do, then do so. وَلَا حَرَجْ, and there's no harm in that. وَمَنْ كَذَبَ عَلَيَّ مُتَبَوِّئًا, but whoever lies against me intentionally, فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ, then let him prepare his abode in the hellfire. So in this tradition we can see here the Prophet concerned about the possibility of something being placed on par with the Quran, that the Quran alone should be vested with that authoritative status, that status of infallibility. By the time hadith began to be collected, which became a serious project during the Abbasid dynasty, there was no longer the risk of it being given a status of authority parallel to the Quran. There was no mediating authority per se in Islam from its earliest rise, and the community was free to approach the Quran either directly or under the guidance, if they so chose, of those who had dedicated themselves to the study of it. It is an evidence of the characteristic freedom of thought in early Islam that during the 1st and 2nd century after the Prophet, a host of accumulations of legal opinion grew up in different centres, for example in Iraq, in the Hijaz, in Syria, and Egypt. These were centred on or attached themselves to an eminent legal personality. The differences in these bodies of legal thought were largely due to the variations in which the Quran was interpreted in the light of local customary law. Now there's a second key source of inerrant authority in Islam, which also develops very early on, from the very inception of Islam itself, And this was the ijma', or consensus of the community. Consensus, ijma', would scarcely need justification, since already during the life of the Prophet himself, and also after his life, fundamental decisions had been made on the basis of it. The decision, for example, during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr to establish an authoritative copy of the Quran was made on the basis of ijma', the consensus of the community. Now, notwithstanding the self-evident nature of the authority of ijma', there were supporting statements of the Prophet on the authoritative status of the community's consensus. So, for example, we have a hadith, لا تجتمع أمتي على خطأ. My community will not unite on error, or does not unite on error. Also, yadullahi ma'al jama'ah. The hand of God is with the majority. Supporting this idea also is the Quran. In Surah 4, verse 115, if anyone contends with the messenger, even after guidance has been plainly conveyed to him, and follows a path other than that becoming to men of faith, or follows a path other than that of the believers, al-mu'mineen, we shall leave him in the path he has chosen, and land him in hell, what an evil refuge. So supporting evidence from the Quran also to adhere, an encouragement, an exhortation even to adhere to the way of the majority, to the way of the believers. Like the Quran, the authoritative statement of ijma', the agreement of the community, was considered to be an indication of the divine will. In contrast to the Quran, whose revelation would cease with the death of the Prophet, ijma' would represent a continued connection with the divine, dynamic and responsive to changes of time and location. It would be through ijma' that the particular centres of law would slowly merge into one another by mental interaction, and the accumulations of legal opinion gradually crystallized into schools in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of Islam, so 200 and 300 years or so after the Prophet Muhammad, during which the schools of law themselves came closer to one another, thanks to the wide measure of agreement, not only on principles, but even on major details. So in Iraq, the school associated with the name of Abu Hanifa, who dies in 767, called the Hanafi school, developed and was systemized by his two disciples, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani. And they ousted, in doing so, the school of Sufyan al-Thawri and others. The other schools of law that would grow to prominence and oust regional competitors were the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school. It was by ijma' or consensus of the community that these schools or madhahib were accepted and would also mutually accept one another as equally orthodox. Now the Shari'ah is not only concerned with practice, of course, but faith also. The Quran clearly aims at reorienting man away from his preoccupation with the temporal towards a focus on the eternal and the transcendent. Worldly attachments are impediments to this and should be removed. With the Quranic impulse to turn towards the divine, to refocus, they developed alongside this legal tradition that I've begun to describe a spiritual tradition. The spiritual tradition would take a similar trajectory to the legal and would culminate in the crystallization of Sufi orders, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries. These also would become established by way of ijma', the consensus of the community, and just like the legal schools, would accept one another as equally orthodox. One would be forgiven at this point for asking or wondering how, without mediating authority that holds a monopoly on interpretation, there can exist any claim to truth within Islam, with all this diversity with all this acceptance, with all of these institutions mutually recognizing each other as orthodox, where then lies the possibility of a claim to truth, absolute truth? Muslim scholars, whether jurists, exegetes or theologians, whilst recognizing the role of subjectivity in the interpretation of the Quran, whilst recognizing that everybody is entitled to approach this text and to interpret it, at the same time, these scholars would not refrain from arguing that some interpretations are in fact better than others. This is not a contradictory position, in that the Quran itself recommends readings or interpretations which are undertaken to attain the best of its meanings. And it also specifies some principles for doing so, establishing both that it is open to multiple readings or interpretations, and that all readings are equally good. Belief in the idea that the text is open to multiple meanings does not then necessarily render one a moral relativist. Just like embracing the idea that the text only has a single meaning, or a verse only has a single meaning, signifies some great virtue. But the key thing to the concept of diversity and the accommodation of diversity in different opinions and perspectives is that all of this is done in the spirit of toleration, mutual acceptance and humility. And that continues to figure even when a scholar, a theologian, a jurist or an exegete believes that his own interpretation is the more correct one. And it was in this spirit, actually, that Imam al-Shafi'i, that the founder of the Shafi'i school, great jurist of the 8th and 9th centuries, he dies in 820, made the famous statement, "My own position is correct, but could possibly be a mistake. My opponent's position is a mistake, but could possibly be correct." I'm not going to go on for more than that. I want this just to be the beginning of a presentation of some thoughts on the idea of diversity in Islam. I focused on the legal tradition and touched upon the spiritual tradition. But this is something that I believe is characteristic of all of the intellectual traditions within Islam. I don't have anything more to say at this point, but except that there is likely to be things that aren't quite clear in what I've said that could do with some expanding upon. So we'd be happy to take questions on those, and also questions on anything related to the topic. So I'll open up now for questions from you. And comments and thoughts, actually. It doesn't have to be a question. Yes.
And you touched at the beginning about the demonstrations, the revolution in Egypt. Obviously, they're calling out for democracy in Egypt. Where does that fit within Sharia? Can you just make things a bit clearer?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
The question is that the call in Egypt of the revolution is for democracy or democratization of Egypt. What's the position of the Sharia in regards to that? Is that your question? I think that the discussion that we're having, or I think some of the ideas that I've presented might begin to help understand what the position of the Sharia is on something like democracy. Because, in fact, democracy, as far as I can see, is that principle of ijma', the principle of the consensus of the community. And so, do not be surprised if, in calling for democracy, those Islamist groups actually have in mind that concept of ijma'. And so, when they engage with the the wider world or the international community will speak in terms of democracy. In their own literature and amongst themselves will speak in terms of the ijma'. Not to say that there's some insincerity or some contradiction or double speech here, but actually firmly in the belief that these two concepts are the very same thing. And so from that point of view, I think this is something that's increasingly being shared by Islamist parties. You see the same in Turkey. The ARC party also has this view, this firm belief that democracy is not incompatible with Islam. And that it is the very principle of ijma', just a different expression of it, in a different language. But that it is the view of the majority, which is being reflected in politics and in decisions taken by authorities and in the way that governments are formed. Yes?
I was hoping you could just clarify something. Because you keep saying Islamist, but doesn't Islamist mean fundamentalist or like militant?
I think it's dangerous to confuse the terms. I think it's problematic because each of them connotes many things. They're terminologies. I'm not going to get into, I don't think I'd like to get into here, or why we should be calling them fundamentalists. It might be more useful to consider what the word Islamist is used to connote.
I just think because like the Islamist, doesn't Islamist mean something bad, whereas, I mean, I hope most people don't think the Brotherhood is bad. Party in Turkey mentions.
Well, the Brotherhood themselves are quite comfortable about using the word to describe themselves, Islami. Islamiyin is something that Islamists are known to use. So it's not pejorative. It's not a negative term necessarily. Islamism, the broadest sort of definition of it, is simply political Islam. The idea that Islam has a key role to play in shaping politics in the public sphere as much as it has a private sphere. Okay? So that's what Islamism is. It doesn't connote anything necessarily negative or positive. That's entirely down to the person who is thinking about the term or the broader context. So it's certainly taken on, though, of course, internationally a generally a negative connotation. One of the things I began with at the beginning of the talk to mention the Ikhwan al-Muslimun was to show that one of the fears that people have of the Islamist parties is this idea that they are monolithic, they have a single agenda, and that is to impose this monolithic legal system, which is the Shari'ah. To understand actually the diversity that already exists in the Shari'ah would help to understand more the dynamics of those groups which are calling for Islamic law to play a role again in society. Okay, so that's the idea there. Any other questions? Yeah, sorry.
In your opinion, what does Sharia talk about in terms of religious liberty? If you could kind of explain that.
Sharia and religious liberty, did you say, or liberty in general? Sorry.
Like the freedom to change religion.
The freedom to change religion. The Sharia is explicit on the permissibility or the importance of having freedom to choose one's religion. La ikraha fi ad-din, qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy is a verse in the 2nd chapter of the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion. And so, with that verse in the Quran, explicit, I think, in its statement that the freedom to choose is important and that there is no compulsion in religion, it is an evidence in itself. Now, historically, the choice of a Muslim to change religions is, and how possible that was, isn't always clear to ascertain. It's not the easiest thing to discern historically. And there are records of, or historical sources to suggest that people would be killed as apostates for, it's argued, for converting from Islam to another religion. But the counter-argument to that, and I think the view of the Shari'ah on this is, first of all, if that happened, then it was plainly wrong and in contradiction to the Shari'ah itself. And also another counter-argument is that when that happens, it happens not because of somebody changing their religion per se, but for other reasons. It's the criminal code being applied for some other crime that's been committed by that individual, which somehow may have been connected also with their change of religion. For example, treason, the crime of treason or treachery. Okay, so there are some counter views to those, to the suggestion that this has happened in Muslim history. Now, there are other ways, of course, that somebody will be made to feel very, very uncomfortable for changing the religion, for leaving Islam, and one of them is to be ostracized by the family and all sorts of other community pressures, for example. Okay? And in fact, this does happen traditionally within Islam. There is no papal authority, for example. There is no mediating authority on defining what Islam is, on precisely defining what is, who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim. Okay? This is something, as I've already begun to describe, which is fairly open to interpretation. The single source of authority, indisputable source of authority, is the Quran itself. Right? But despite that, the possibilities of interpretations, you still have, of course, the pressures of the community. Okay? And the idea of consensus also, which can bring about its own kind of, which has its own force. All right? So, in that sense, it's not to say that anything goes, or somebody can act within the Muslim community completely, with complete liberty. There are going to be societal pressures and so on to conform, as in any society. All right? But it's much more difficult to find a finger to point at that person and to say, oh, you are a non-Muslim, for example. A finger which actually has authority, that is. Oh, you may find individual Muslims saying so. But an institution able to excommunicate is something that you don't find so easily in Islam, at least in Sunni Islam. So I hope that begins to answer your question. Yeah.
If we're going back to the ijma,
yeah.
Did the opinion of the majority ever overturn absolute agreed law, or what is made halal and haram from the Sharia?
First of all, the ijma of the community, the consensus of the community, can establish haram and halal, or something that is compulsory, for example. It's authoritative. It can make something binding on the community. Is your question what happens when there's some conflict between the ijma of the community?
No, I'm saying, like, if there's decreed law from the Sharia, could that be overturned by the ijma, as in like the community, the majority? Could that be overturned? For example, what is made halal and haram, could that be overturned by the ijma?
It's difficult. I think the ijma itself establishes what the decreed law is. At least that's the dynamics of the Shari'ah. Okay? So the text is there, the Quran is there. As I say, the single most important authority within Islam. Now the Quran doesn't simply speak. Okay? It needs to be read and interpreted. Yes, it's the repository of the divine law, the Shari'ah. It's there contained within. But it doesn't speak to either an individual or a community. It has to be read. It's got to be interpreted. So those divine laws have to be extracted. Now, one of those processes for the extraction of the Shari'ah from the Quran is the consensus of the community, is the ijma. Is the view taken. It can begin from the reading of an individual, say a scholar, for example, which then becomes accepted as, by the community, authoritative, an acceptable reading. But ijma is one of the key ways that law is established in Islam. Now you may say, well, what about if there is a clear text in the Quran which doesn't need reading? It simply speaks, it tells you, do this or don't do that. What happens then when there's a conflict between it and ijma? If there is a verse as explicit as that, then according to the Shari'ah, the verse takes precedence over ijma. But the idea of ijma is something that's connected to the believing community. So you don't expect that to happen. If there is an explicit text in the Quran, you don't expect the believing community to go against something that's explicit in the Quran, an explicit do or an explicit don't, which simply isn't open to interpretation. Okay? I hope that sort of explains. Was that your question? Is that an answer that you're happy with?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Going back to the brother's question about democracy in Islam, democracy from the Greek